me set the scene. On October 22nd, 1441, a special contest was held beneath the magnificent new dome of the cathedral in Florence. The Medici family sponsored the contest. The judges came from among the Pope's entourage, and in attendance were the Archbishop of Florence, members of the city's government, the Venetian ambassador, and also, so we're told, the entire population of Florence, some 40,000 people. The prize was to be a silver crown worked into the likeness of a laurel. What was this competition? It was a poetry contest, but not just any poetry contest. It was a contest for poetry written in, as the rules made clear, the vernacular, the lingua fiorentina, or Florentine tongue, what we think of today as Italian. In other words, in everyday speech, not in Latin. The aim of the competition was to show how great poetry could be written in the vernacular as well as in Latin, that the vernacular could deal with any exalted topic. 8 contestants were chosen, and one after another, they rose to recite their verses. Hello and welcome. I'm Ross King. This is Renaissance Discoveries, and in this video, I want to talk about the discovery in Italy of the vernacular, or at least the discovery of the prestige and expressive powers of the vernacular. In one of my other videos, I discussed the development over 2,000 years of Latin from the Roman Republic to Renaissance Florence, where in the 1400s, Latin was rediscovered and purified, purged of its medieval corruptions, and returned, so a group of scholars hoped, to the pristine and elegant state in which great writers such as Cicero and Virgil had left it. But at the same time that these scholars in Florence were uncovering and rediscovering the power of classical Latin, some of them were also discovering the elegance and power of their mother tongue, the lingua volgare, or the vulgar tongue, vulgar not being a reference to rude, tasteless, or indecent expressions, but rather a derivation of the Latin vulgus, meaning the common people. There was in Florence, as in everywhere else throughout history, a language of the common people, a language that in Italy and in many other places throughout Europe had developed out of and in opposition to the Latin that had flourished under the ancient Romans. And it was this humble type of speech that in the 1400s in Florence suddenly caught the attention of the well-schooled multilingual brainiacs who helped to invent what we call the Renaissance. I want to begin the story with the rediscovery of an ancient work, a treatise on rhetoric by the 1st century BC statesman and writer Cicero. The treatise was called Brutus, and a manuscript of this work, unseen for centuries, was discovered in 1421 in the library of the cathedral in Lodi, northern Italy. The Brutus of the title is Marcus Junius Brutus of Et Brute fame, and the work gives a kind of history of speech-making in Rome and of its styles and practitioners over the previous couple of centuries. In the course of discussing various orators, Cicero describes how one of them speaks with what he calls a sapor vernaculus, a vernacular flavor. Now, vernacular is an interesting word. The root word verna meant slave, specifically a slave that was born and raised in the master's house, and perhaps also born from the master's loins. So the vernacular flavor that Cicero is talking about is a language used by someone quite humble, the language of a slave or low-born person in the home, the product of humble experience rather than refined education. When scholars in Florence first read this passage in 1421, it raised the question of what language low-born people in Rome would have used, i.e., what exactly was this vernacular? Was it a version of Latin, or was it something else? And if it was something else, what was its relationship to Latin? Classical Latin, the language of Cicero, Virgil, and Julius Caesar, was one of the great inventions of the human mind. But even as it was being perfected in the 1st century BC by Roman writers and statesmen such as Cicero, it had this fascinating B-side, this language of the people of Rome, the colorful and varied speech of shopkeepers, merchants, farmers, poor people, gladiators, slaves, peoples whose families had emigrated to Rome from places such as North Africa or Spain. This language of the common people, this vulgar Latin, would go on to have a spectacular legacy. Today, people complain about those who speak bad English and how the English language is deteriorating or at least changing. The ancient Romans were equally sensitive regarding Latin. Cicero complains about how in his time there was what he calls an influx of many impure speakers coming from different places, i.e., the many thousands of immigrants coming to Rome, many of them in chains as slaves, as Rome pursued its highly successful wars of expansion. Cicero therefore appealed for what he called in the Brutus a purge of language and the invoking of theory as an objective control, not subject to change like the easily distorted rule of common usage. So the common language is changing, and he wants to have Latin fixed through what he calls theory, through a set of rules. He wanted the rules of grammar to be established and enforced to stop this so-called impurity that was infecting Latin because of, for example, mass immigration. It just so happens that this is exactly what Julius Caesar tried to do with his book on Latin grammar, De Analogia, most of which, alas, is now lost. Caesar composed this treatise as he crossed the Alps with his army to do battle with the Gauls. Such was evidently how the great man spent his few precious moments of leisure. Cicero wrote that in this book, Caesar tried to correct distorted and corrupt usage. But let's face it, Caesar and Cicero were spitting into the wind. Caesar was not going to conquer the vernacular as handily as he conquered the Gauls. The gap between the pure language of Cicero and the earthier language of the street or field, if we can put it that way, widened in the centuries that followed. More than 400 years after Cicero's death, we have St. Augustine referring to how people were dropping their H's. The word homo, man, was being pronounced omo, which of course is going to become uomo in Italian or homme in French. Augustine was fairly forgiving, but not so his contemporary Saint Jerome, the man who translated the Bible into Latin in the last decades of the 4th century AD. When a friend wrote to Jerome asking about how she should raise her daughter, he replied that she should watch the girl's Latin very carefully because the tongue is spoiled by a foreign accent and its native speech debased by alien elements. Jerome fought a rearguard action against these encroachments, against these alien elements. He once ticked off a friend who, instead of using the classical word emere to buy, used the vulgar comprare, which of course was eventually going to segue into comprare in Italian or comprar in Spanish and Portuguese. So we can see what's happening. Latin words, through common usage, are morphing into something slightly different. During the empire's decline and after its collapse towards the end of the 5th century, Latin began to evolve independently within each local area and eventually diverged into dozens of distinct languages, into what are going to become the Romance languages of Europe: Italian, French, Spanish, Catalan, Portuguese, and so forth. By the way, here's a quick trivia question for you. What living language today is closest to Latin? Answer at the end of the video. We don't have to take Jerome's word for it because we can see this process of linguistic shape-shifting taking place thanks to a text from around 300 or 400 AD, roughly around the time, that is, of Augustine and Jerome. This was the so-called Appendix Probi, which listed common grammatical and spelling mistakes which the author hoped to fix. It listed 227 frequent mistakes and their corrections. For example, it stressed that for the word old, one was to use vetulus instead of veclus, columna instead of columna, for the ear, auris instead of auricula, for green, viridis instead of virdis, callida for hot instead of calda, and so on. The interesting thing here is that we have a snapshot through these errors of the way Latin was developing into the Romance languages. To stick simply with Italian, veclus is going to become vecchio, auricula is going to become orecchio, verdis is going to become verde. And so, as far as this is concerned, the appendix probi is a finger in a dike that is about to burst. These changes to Standard Latin raise the question of when Latin ceased to be spoken and understood by the illiterate masses in Europe, or when the language spoken and understood by the illiterate masses stopped being close enough to Latin to be called Latin. This shift obviously would have varied region by region around Europe, but it's usually assumed that Latin remained a living language until at least the end of the 7th century, the late 600s AD, after which virtually everyone who understood Latin needed to learn it as a second language. We know that by the year 813, in large parts of the Frankish kingdom, that is, in what is now France, the people could not understand Latin because a council of the church convened that year in Tours in the Loire Valley ordered that parish priests should preach to the people in the rusticam Romanum linguam, the rustic Roman tongue. The parishioners could not understand Latin, so they were to hear the sermons in their own rustic language. This decree is justifiably seen as the birth certificate of the French language. By this point, the language spoken by the people of the Frankish kingdom had drifted off the ancient Roman moorings on the Tiber and gone its own exploratory way along the rivers and through the valleys of France. And by this point, there is the perception and acceptance by the church, no less, that there is now a common language of the people that is separate from Latin. The birth certificate for the Italian language comes surprisingly late. It dates from 150 years later, the early 960s, and concerns the ownership of land by the Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino. The vernacular was already used in oral communication, obviously, but here it appears for the first time, as far as we know from surviving documents, as a written language. And crucially, it's closer to modern-day Italian than it is to Latin. But what does it mean to speak of an Italian language at this point? The phrase actually makes no sense. In the centuries that followed, the people on the Italian peninsula sometimes referred to themselves as speaking what they called Latino, as opposed to, say, Arabic or Hebrew. In other words, they recognized themselves as speaking something akin to Latin. But the language spoken up and down the peninsula varied considerably, and not just from Latin. Someone who tells us very clearly of this state of affairs, if I can fast forward a few hundred years now, is Dante, who in about 1304 complains of a cacophony of the many varieties of Italian speech. He says, for example, that the language of the Sicilians is different from that of the Apulians, and that of the Apulians different from that of the people of Rome, and that of the Romans different from the people of Spoleto, and on and on. Dante claims that Italy presents a range of at least 14 different vernaculars, or what we would call dialects. But these regions, he points out, also have internal differences, so that the Tuscan dialect spoken in Siena is different from that of Arezzo or Florence. And in fact, he says there are variations even within a single city. And so Dante concludes that there are well beyond 1,000 different types of speech in Italy in his day. He then examines which of these many dialects is the best, the most beautiful and expressive. And along the way, he dishes out plenty of insults. He says the language spoken by the people in Rome is not so much a vernacular as a vile jargon, the ugliest of all the languages spoken in Italy. And he says this should come as no surprise, since the Romans are an ill-mannered bunch who are the ugliest people in Italy. In fact, he disses the Italian language as a whole. He writes that there are many nations and peoples who speak a more elegant and practical language than do the Italians. If Dante wanted to find a good Italian vernacular, you would think he would turn to his hometown, Florence. And he notes that there is certainly a widespread opinion in Florence that the Florentines possess the most illustrious vernacular. But Dante begs to differ. He says the Florentines speak a foul jargon, and he says there are many regions and many cities with a much more noble and more delightful manner of speaking than you find in Florence. Now, when Dante wrote those passages in 1304 or thereabouts, he seems to have been in a particularly bad mood, nursing a grudge against the Florentines who had exiled him a couple of years earlier in 1302. Because elsewhere in his writings, in a work he wrote only a year or two later, he was much more bullish about the vernacular. In this later work, the Convivio, he wrote that Latin had the advantage over the vernacular in that it's unchanging, while they are unstable and corruptible. Although, as I discussed in my other video on Latin, many people came to believe that Latin was also becoming corrupt and unstable. And in fact, of course, as we've seen, that's exactly what Cicero thought was happening to Latin in the 1st century BC. Dante said that Latin was more nuanced than the vernacular. He said it expresses many things conceived in the mind which the vernacular cannot. And he also thought that Latin was more beautiful. However, having made those points, he then claimed that the vernacular was almost as beautiful as Latin, or at least he seems to imply when it's used by someone like him. And he also believed that it can express what he called the loftiest and most unusual conceptions almost as aptly, fully, and gracefully as Latin. He then comes to his key point. Latin is for the few, the vernacular for the many. He concludes the first book of Convivio with a flourish and a prediction. This shall be the new light, the new sun, which shall rise when the worn out one shall set, and shall give light to them who are in shadow and in darkness, because of the old sun which does not enlighten them. The vernacular, in other words, the language of the people, is going to bring enlightenment in the way that Latin, because it has to be learned, has to be a second language in the way that Latin cannot. And of course, in many ways, Dante was being a prophet here because as he wrote these words, he was beginning work on a great work of literature in the vernacular, in the lingua fiorentina, that is the Divine Comedy. He explained in a letter to a friend that the poem was a comedy because of the fact that the language is lowly and humble, the speech of the masses in which even women folk converse. It's an open question how closely Dante's language in the Divine Comedy actually approximated the everyday written and spoken language of the people of Florence, but at least he was using a language that was, without doubt, intelligible to them, as Latin was not. Because writers in the 1300s tell us that Dante's works were read aloud in the theaters and crossroads of the city, and one of them claimed that his writings were even known to idiote, idiots in the shops and in the marketplace. Now, what happens when you compose a long and undeniably important poem, such as the Divine Comedy, in a vernacular language, in a language that can be understood by the so-called idiots? Dante obviously felt he could bring enlightenment, but what did other people think? There was certainly some snobbish resistance to the humble language chosen by Dante. Even Petrarch, Dante's younger contemporary, who wrote in the vernacular himself, complained that the Divine Comedy appealed to dyers, drapers, shopkeepers, and thugs. A few decades after Petrarch, in about 1400, a Florentine scholar named Niccolo Niccoli claimed that Dante should be left to the wool workers, and the pages of the Divine Comedy were fit only, Niccoli claimed, for wrapping fish and cuts of meat. There was a feeling amongst the intelligentsia, the literati, that the vernacular was not suited to a lofty purpose, such as explaining the ways of God to man, which was, after all, what Dante was doing. Only Latin, it was believed, had the necessary gravitas, dignity, elegance, and nuance. In fact, various attempts were made to raise up the work linguistically, to give the Divine Comedy a greater dignity by translating it into Latin. One of the first attempts was by the Florentine chancellor, a man named Coluccio Salutati, a great scholar who rendered snippets of the Divine Comedy in a Latin worthy of Cicero. Then in 1416, a Franciscan monk translated the entirety of the Divine Comedy into Latin. He did so, he said, in order that non-Italian speakers would be able to read it, that is, educated people in France or Germany who could read Latin, but of course not the lingua fiorentina in which Dante had written his poem. A decade later, in about 1430, a second Latin translation appeared with a similar mission. And so the greatest work of any European vernacular had the honor of being rendered into Latin. Despite these problems, prejudices, and impediments, the Italian vernacular was steadily gaining traction. The supposedly lowly and humble speech used by Dante began to spread. Petrarch wrote poetry in the vernacular, as did Giovanni Boccaccio, the man who wrote the Decameron. And with Dante, they became known by the early 1400s as the Tre Corone, the three crowns of Italian literature. Their literary efforts burnished the prestige of this supposedly humble mode of writing and speaking, showing that it had tremendous and beautiful expressive powers. Now, it's interesting and important to note that Florence in the 1300s and 1400s had, as far as we can tell, the highest literacy rate in Europe. It's much debated, but adult male literacy in the vernacular has been estimated at about 70% in Florence, compared to around 25% in most other cities, and compared to in the countryside, probably only about 5% tops. This high literacy rate meant there was a demand for books in the vernacular, not only ones composed in the vernacular, like the Divine Comedy, but ones translated into it from Latin. Therefore, many Latin classics, such as the works of Cicero, were translated into the vernacular in Florence for eager readers. Also, many of the multilingual brainiacs in Florence who were incredibly adept at Latin also wrote books in the vernacular. Leonardo Bruni, for example, a man who you'll note pops up in virtually all of these videos, wrote books in both Latin and the vernacular. And some of his most important Latin works, such as his History of Florence, were translated by others into the vernacular. There was also Leon Battista Alberti, who likewise wrote in both Latin and the vernacular. In 1435, for example, when he was living in Florence, Alberti wrote in Latin his famous book on painting, De Pictura, which a year later he promptly translated into the vernacular as Della Pittura, so that friends such as the architect Filippo Brunelleschi would be able to read it. It's revealing that Brunelleschi did not know Latin. He had one of the greatest brains, not just in the 15th century, but in all of history, and yet he did not know Latin. He could not have read the inscription on his tomb, which declares him a genius. Nor incidentally, to jump forward a few decades, did Leonardo da Vinci know Latin. So we have developing a group of highly intelligent artists and engineers who mix in the highest levels of society, who have massive reputations, but who have no Latin. Dante's dire estimation of the Florentine tongue as brutal jargon was completely revised in the 1400s. Bruni, for example, argued that the Florentine vernacular was the best in Italy. He said it excels over all others, for Florence is the Italian city reputed to have the purest and most polished speech. This positive estimation was confirmed by the fact that Lorenzo de Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, wrote poetry in the vernacular, and by the fact that in the 1470s he sent as a diplomatic gift to the son of the King of Naples a collection of Tuscan poetry. Some 20 years after that, the Duke of Milan, Lodovico Sforza, appointed a Florentine as his court poet, saying that the elegant Florentine speech will give our city an opportunity to bring more polish and smoothness to our own rather raw manner of speaking. This was in 1495. At exactly that moment, Leonardo da Vinci, another Florentine, was painting the Last Supper for Duke Lodovico. And so the Florentines excelled not just at painting, but also at speaking and writing in their native tongue. Now you're probably wondering who won the poetry contest in Florence in 1441. The answer is no one. The judges couldn't make up their minds, so they donated the silver garland of laurels to the cathedral itself. All hell broke loose. People felt cheated, not least the poets. So the competition turned out to be a bit of an ignominious episode for all its stately grandeur. But it did show that the new son of Dante was on the rise, and in fact, this sun would cast its light across all of Italy, because the lingua fiorentina is the language that would ultimately become what we call Italian. But that is another story. Now, the answer to the trivia question, what living language is closest to Latin? It is Sardo, the language of the island of Sardinia. Thank you so much for watching. Please watch more, please subscribe, and please, if you want to know more about the multilingual brainiacs taking Florence by storm in the 1400s, do seriously consider buying my latest offering, The Bookseller of Florence, available in your favorite bookshop.